Slowly, imperceptibly, the threads that connected the expedition to reality frayed and dissolved, as if the island's silent tide reached beyond its shores to seep into the fabric of collective memory itself. Dr. Evelyn Hart sat alone in a dim university office, the glow of a failing lamp casting long shadows over scattered reports and fragmented recordings. Her fingers trembled as she traced the faded ink on a brittle map, one that no longer bore the island's name. The data streams she once controlled had been overwritten, erased like footprints washed away by an indifferent sea. The faces of her team, their voices once vibrant in her mind, now echoed faintly, like whispers carried on a wind she could no longer grasp. Outside, in a coastal town miles from the ocean's edge, old fishermen gathered at the local tavern, their conversations thin with superstition and awe. "Have you heard about the island that vanished?" one whispered, eyes darting to the window as if expecting it to reappear. Another shook his head, voice low and trembling. "It's just a ghost story, passed down from those who never came back. A place that swallows names and memories," they say. These murmurs were the only remnants of a truth too vast to be contained in spoken word or written page. The island had become legend, a specter haunting the edges of human understanding. Meanwhile, Lena Carr found herself submerged in the musty depths of an archive room, surrounded by crumbling tomes and manuscripts that seemed to sigh with forgotten histories. She ran her fingers over ancient script-scurved symbols and broken glyphs that unnervingly resembled the lost language she had fought to preserve on the island. Each character was a fragile echo of a people erased from time, their stories swallowed by the island's silence. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and despair. These fragments might be the key to understanding, yet they also embodied the overwhelming futility of remembrance. At dusk, the seashore lay bathed in fading light, the tide lapping softly against sand etched with indistinct footprints. The ocean carried whispers, forgotten names, memories of lives erased into the vast unknown. Evelyn walked the shoreline, the salt wind biting at her skin, her mind a tempest of loss and longing. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a presence itself, thick and suffocating, pressing against her consciousness with the weight of oblivion. The fading of the expedition from collective memory was the island's final conquest. Scientific discoveries transformed into ghost stories, languages into unintelligible symbols, memories into myths. The island's power transcended physical erasure. It seeped into the human psyche, eroding the very foundations of identity and existence. Evelyn's obsessive recordings, Lena's whispered translations, Captain Reed's pragmatic resolve, Dr. Ortiz's skepticism, more became mere shadows in a world increasingly unwilling to remember. Yet, amid the encroaching silence, faint embers of resistance glimmered. The act of remembering, of naming, of speaking the unspeakable, persisted as a fragile defiance against the tide. The expedition's legacy, though blurred and fragmented, lingered in the hearts of those who dared to recall, however faintly. As night deepened, Evelyn's thoughts turned inward. Was it possible to hold on to something so ephemeral as memory when the very world conspired to forget? Could the human need for connection and meaning withstand the relentless pull of oblivion? The silence beyond the island was not emptied, was alive, a living echo of all that had been lost and all that might yet be reclaimed. And as the tide whispered against the shore, carrying with it the last fragments of forgotten names, Evelyn understood that some stories, though buried, never truly vanish. They wait, hidden beneath waves of silence, for a voice brave enough to speak them once more. In this place where memory and myth entwined, where the boundaries between reality and oblivion blurred, The expedition's echoes endured, fragile, haunting, and eternal. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood alone at the bow of the ship, her dark hair whipping around her face as the cold wind tugged at her clothes. The setting sun bled hues of crimson and violet across the horizon, but it was the subtle movements beneath the waves that held her attention. There, in the fading light, the water pulsed with a cadence that was at once familiar and profoundly alien, a silent rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a vanished island. For weeks, since the island had disappeared from all maps and digital records, the crew had been trying to make sense of the lingering signs. The island itself was gone, vanished without a trace, but its presence clung stubbornly to the ocean around them. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she traced the patterns of the currents with a practiced gaze. There was something unnatural here, something that defied the laws of nature and science alike. Behind her, footsteps approached. Captain Jonas Reed joined her silently, his weather-beaten face etched with concern. He was a man of the sea, grounded in pragmatism and experience, yet even he could not dismiss what the crew had been witnessing. "The instruments keep showing irregularities," Jonas said quietly, nodding toward the ship's navigation console. "Currents shifting without cause, depth readings that don't add up. It's like the sea itself is alive, and it's hiding something." Evelyn didn't reply immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the horizon, where the ocean seemed to ripple with a barely perceptible pulse. "The island's not gone," she murmured. "Not really. It's out there, somewhere, in the tides. It's woven into the water itself, a cycle we don't yet understand." Below deck, Mira Chen was bent over her samples, her fingers stained with salt and seaweed. The marine biologist had been the first to notice the strange bioluminescent patterns flickering beneath the surface organisms that glowed with unnatural rhythms, as if responding to some silent command. "It's like they're signaling," Mira said when Evelyn came down to join her, her voice barely above a whisper. "The marine life. It feels like it's carrying the island's memory, a trace of its existence embedded in the currents." Evelyn nodded slowly, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her shoulders. The island was not simply a place that had vanished. It was a force, a presence that transcended physical form. Its erasure was not an end but a transformation, a slow, creeping seepage into the ocean's pulse, an echo that might one day swell into something far more terrifying. Night fell swiftly, wrapping the ship in a cloak of stars and shadow. The crew gathered on deck, their faces pale in the moonlight as the ocean's usual sounds faded into a profound, unsettling silence. Even the waves seemed to hold their breath. Evelyn broke the silence with a soft, urgent whisper. "The tide will return. The island's cycle isn't over. We thought we escaped oblivion, but oblivion has reached deeper than we imagined." The stillness pressed in around them, a tangible weight of dread and anticipation. The island's legacy was not a closed chapter, but an open wound, bleeding into the currents and tides that shaped their world. And somewhere, beneath the waves, the silent terror waited, patient and eternal. As the ship cut through the black waters, the crew could only wonder and fear what the next tide might bring. The ocean's restless pulse was a constant reminder of the island's haunting presence. Evelyn found herself drawn to the rail night after night, watching the water shimmer with unnatural light. The bioluminescent creatures beneath the surface flickered in patterns that resembled ancient symbols. Lena had once tried desperately to decipher symbols that spoke of cycles, erasure, and return. Captain Reed's pragmatism was tested daily, his logbook filled with notes of strange navigational anomalies, inexplicable fog banks that rolled in without warning, and the eerie silence that swallowed radio signals whenever they neared the coordinates where the island had once stood. "We're caught in its wake," Jonas confessed one evening, his voice low and serious. "Not just the island itself, but whatever force it is. It's like we're trapped in a loop." Mira's scientific curiosity warred with growing unease. The marine ecosystems were unlike anything recorded, shifting and adapting in ways that defied logic. The organisms' glowing patterns seemed to form messages, warnings perhaps, or remnants of a language long erased. Evelyn's mind circled these thoughts relentlessly. The island's cycle was a tidal terror not confined to geography, was a rhythm of oblivion, a slow erasure that began with names and memories and now reached into the very fabric of nature. "We need to document this," Evelyn urged one afternoon. "If the island's essence flows through the tides, then understanding the cycle could be our only defense." But even as they gathered data, the creeping silence thickened. Communication faltered. Words felt inadequate against the weight of the unknown. The ocean's pulse was a lullaby and a warning, a reminder that the island's story was far from finished. One night, as Evelyn lay awake in her cabin, the ship rocked gently on the waves. She closed her eyes and heard it a faint whisper beneath the roar of the sea, a voice that spoke not in words but in absence. It was the silence of forgotten names, the hush of histories erased, the tide's eternal return. She understood then that the island was not just a place lost to time, but a force that would linger, haunt, and perhaps one day reclaim all that it had swallowed. The cycle of erasure was not a curse that ended, but a story that repeated, endlessly, beneath the salt and the silence. The dawn would come soon, but with it, Evelyn knew, the tide's return would bring new terror's ghosts of memory, shadows of forgotten selves, and the relentless pull of oblivion waiting just beyond the horizon. And so they sailed on into the unknown, carried by the sea's haunting rhythm, caught forever in the tide's return. It was a silence so profound, it felt as though the very air was swallowing sound before it could reach any ear. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of their camp, eyes scanning the shifting horizon where familiar landmarks once stood firm. Now, the shoreline seemed to dissolve into a mist that flickered with spectral uncertainty, as if the island itself were peeling away layers of reality, leaving nothing behind. Behind her, Lena Carr crouched beside a cracked stone tablet half buried in sand, her pale fingers trembling as they traced the faint outlines of ancient glyphs. Her voice was soft, a whisper barely louder than the breeze, yet it rose in defiance against the creeping void. "Terror," she murmured, "the sea, nail, the wind." Each word was a fragile anchor, a desperate attempt to tether the island's shifting essence to something concrete, something named. Evelyn's gaze shifted to the others. Marcus Lynn stood nearby, his leather jacket dusted with sand, eyes narrowed as he watched Lena with a mixture of skepticism and awe. Captain Jonas Reed paced not far off, his weather-beaten face drawn tight with worry. The silence pressed in on them all, a physical weight that seemed to seep into the marrow of their bones. "Why do you keep saying their names?" Marcus asked, his voice rough, betraying the exhaustion beneath his bravado. Lena looked up, her eyes wide and haunted. "Because if we don't, they disappear. Not just the island, but everything within it. The memories, the histories, the people. Names hold power. They are the last thread connecting us to existence." Evelyn nodded slowly, her fingers clutching the worn leather strap of her journal. "She's right, we've seen it. The more we forget, the more the island consumes. Naming is our resistance." The group fell silent again, the weight of that truth settling like ash. The island was not simply a place, it was a force, an erasure that sought to unravel the very fabric of being. Each forgotten name was a loss, not only of memory, but of self. Night descended with a chill that bit deeper than the sea breeze. Around a flickering lantern, Lena read aloud from her hastily scrawled journal, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This is Dr. Evelyn Hart. This place is called the Salt and the Silence. We remember." Her words floated into the stillness, fragile and defiant. For a few moments, the silence seemed to retreat, as if the act of naming pushed back against oblivion. But the reprieve was brief. Conversations grew terse, memories faltered, and the team's cohesion frayed. The island's influence seeped into their minds, blurring edges of identity and sowing doubt. Evelyn found herself questioning not only the world around her, but her own existence. Who was she if her past could be erased like a tide washing away footprints in the sand? In the quiet moments, Marcus admitted his fears. What if we're already gone? What if this place is just the space between being and nothing? Evelyn's eyes met his, reflecting the same dread. Then we fight to be more than whispers in the dark. We fight to be named, to be remembered. But even as she spoke, the silence returned, heavier and more absolute. The island waited, patient and inexorable, to reclaim all that dared to trespass into its domain. The chapter closed on a chilling image, Lena's voice rising in a chant of forgotten words, echoing against the void, a fragile testament to the human need for memory, identity, and the names that bind us to existence. The question lingered in the air: how long could they hold on before becoming nothing more than forgotten names themselves? The silence deepened, swallowing hope and sound alike, as the island whispered its ancient, terrible song. And somewhere beneath the salt and the silence, the island listened. The usual sounds of the sea, the rhythmic crash of waves, the distant cries of seabirds were swallowed whole by an oppressive stillness that seemed to shroud the entire island. Her boots sank slightly into the damp sand, but even the faintest scrape against the ground was silenced. It was as if the island itself had swallowed sound, erasing it from existence as effectively as it was erasing their memories. Evelyn's breath came shallow, her dark eyes scanning the grey horizon that melted indistinctly into the fog. The landscape around her was blurred, every edge softened by the creeping mist that seemed to absorb light and sound alike. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her notebook, the words she had obsessively recorded suddenly feeling fragile, as if the ink itself might dissolve into the silence. Behind her, the camp was eerily quiet. Lena's voice, once a gentle murmur of whispered names and lost languages, had dwindled to near silence. Evelyn could hear only the faintest rustle of fabric cleaner sitting huddled in a corner, her pale hair falling over her face as she repeated the forgotten words like a fragile lifeline. Each whispered syllable was a desperate attempt to anchor herself to some fragment of identity before it too was swept away by the tide of oblivion. The psychological weight of the island pressed on them all. Captain Jonas Reed stood at his usual post near the edge of the forest, his weather-beaten face shadowed with uncharacteristic doubt. The stoicism that had anchored the expedition now cracked beneath the relentless silence. His eyes darted nervously into the fog, as if expecting the island's spectral silhouettes to emerge at any moment. Even his steady hands betrayed a flicker of unease when he gripped the rail of a makeshift barricade. In the dim light of the camp's central tent, Dr. Samuel Ortiz paced like a man unraveling, his thin frame tense and restless. His usual sharp wit faltered, replaced by muttered fragments of skepticism and fear. The silence seemed to gnaw at his reason, dissolving the boundaries between scientific logic and creeping dread. His voice, when it came, was a broken whisper swallowed by the void. A testament to the island's erasure of not just sound, but sanity. Evelyn's mind raced, struggling to piece together a strategy to fight what felt like an inevitable descent into nothingness. The island's silence was a manifestation of loss of memory, identity, and history. It was a void that erased not only the present, but also the past, severing the fragile threads that tethered the team to themselves and to one another. She thought back to the earliest days of the expedition, when curiosity and excitement had filled the air. Now, those feelings seemed like distant echoes, fading into the slow, relentless quiet. The island was more than a place. It was a force, a living embodiment of oblivion that consumed names, memories, and ultimately, existence itself. Lena's whispered incantations offered a fleeting resistance, a fragile hope that naming could anchor them against erasure. Yet even those words felt fragile, like sand slipping through desperate fingers. The silence deepened, swallowing their voices, their histories, their very selves. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the ocean, its tides now a muted, ghostly rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the island's erasing power. The sea was no longer a source of life, but a harbinger of oblivion, drawing the scientists ever closer to vanishing. The oppressive quiet wrapped around her like a shroud as she realized the full scope of their predicament. To survive, they would have to confront not only the island's physical dangers, but the terror of complete erasure of fate worse than death, where existence itself was forgotten. Her hands tightened around the notebook, a symbol of her desperate grasp on knowledge and memory. Somewhere within the silence lay the key to resisting the island's tide. But with every passing moment, the silence deepened, and the line between reality and oblivion blurred. The island waited patiently, its spectral fog swallowing sound and memory alike, as Evelyn took a breath and stepped forward into the void. The camp was a shadow of itself. Once vibrant with voices and purposeful movement, it now lay draped in a quiet so absolute it was almost physical. Every attempt to speak was greeted by emptiness. Every gesture felt muted. The scientists were ghosts within their own memories, haunted by the slow erosion of their identities. Lena sat cross-legged near a flickering lantern, her pale fingers tracing the cracked pages of a tattered journal. Her lips moved in silent prayer, whispering names that the island tried to steal. Each word was a fragile act of defiance, a small beacon against the encroaching darkness, but even her whispered voices seemed too thin, fading into the oppressive silence like dying embers. Evelyn watched her, a pang of sorrow twisting her gut. She knew that the island's silence was not merely the absence of noise, but a force that stripped away the very essence of being. The scientists were losing themselves, slipping into an abyss where names, memories, and histories were swallowed whole. Captain Reed's silhouette appeared at the edge of the clearing, his broad frame tense as he scanned the fog. The rugged lines of his face were etched with worry, a stark contrast to his usual calm. He spoke haltingly, his voice a rare ripple in the quiet. "We can't let this silence take us," he said, though even his words seemed to falter before the void. Dr. Ortiz leaned against a tree, his glasses reflecting the dim light. His usual cynicism had given way to raw fear. "It's like the island is rewriting reality," he muttered, eyes darting nervously. "We're becoming nothing." Evelyn nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "We have to hold on to who we are," she said firmly. "Through language, through memory, through connection." But even as she spoke, the silence stretched between them, a vast, gaping chasm that no words could bridge. Night fell with a heavy silence that pressed down on the island like a weight. The fog thickened, swallowing the camp in a grey shroud. Evelyn lay awake, the darkness around her deeper than the absence of light. It was the absence of presence. Her mind drifted, memories flickering like fragile flames. Faces, names, moments of laughter and fear all threatened to vanish. She clutched her notebook tightly, the pages filled with hastily scrawled observations and desperate attempts to preserve reality. Outside her tent, the tide whispered a sound so faint it was nearly imagined. It was the island's heartbeat, a reminder that the erasure was inevitable, creeping closer with every wave. Evelyn's thoughts spiraled into the silence, a meditation on loss and oblivion. The island was a mirror reflecting the terror of non-existence, a place where memories and names were devoured until nothing remained. She whispered a name, her own feeling the fragile thread of identity stretched taut. The silence answered with a void. Morning brought no relief. The fog lingered, a suffocating veil that dulled senses and blurred reality. The island's silence was a living thing, pulsing with a slow, relentless hunger. Evelyn rose, stepping carefully through the damp grass. Her footsteps left no sound, her breath a shallow whisper. She met Lena's gaze, finding in those pale eyes a reflection of her own fear and determination. "We must keep naming," Lena said softly. "It's the only way to hold ourselves here." Evelyn nodded, voice steady despite the trembling inside. "Then we name, we remember, we fight the silence with words." Together, they began to speak, their voices fragile threads weaving a tapestry of sound against the void. The island listened, patient and indifferent, as the silence deepened around them. The battle for memory had become a battle for existence itself. The silence deepened, and with it, the terror of being forgotten. Evelyn's voice broke the quiet once more, a trembling defiance against the abyss. She looked to the horizon, where sea and sky merged into an indistinct grey. "We will not vanish without a trace," she vowed, even as the island whispered its cruel lullaby. The salt air was thick with absence, the silence a vast ocean swallowing all sound, all memory, all hope. And in that void, the true horror lay not in death, but in the slow, inexorable erasure of being. The silence deepened. Evelyn's heart sat hunched over her scattered notes. The pages were stained and torn, each bearing fragments of observations and hastily scribbled theories that now seemed as ephemeral as the memories she desperately tried to hold on to. Outside, the island's persistent fog crept closer, swallowing sound and light with a voracious hunger. Her fingers trembled as she traced the inked lines, the words blurring and slipping away like grains of sand through a clenched fist. Evelyn's sharp eyes, dulled by exhaustion and creeping despair, caught the faintest traces of symbols Lena had painstakingly recorded, ancient glyphs that defied translation but resonated with a strange familiarity. Something about the island's silence was not merely absence, but a presence of force that manipulated reality itself. "Evelyn," a voice whispered, fragile yet insistent. It was Lena, stepping softly into the tent, her pale hair tumbling over her face like a veil. "I found more of the language. It's incomplete, but it speaks of preservation through forgetting." Evelyn looked up, meeting the quiet urgency in Lena's gaze. "Preservation through forgetting." Lena nodded, her voice barely audible. "The island is not just erasing usets holding memories, histories, but only by letting them fade from the world. It's a paradox." Outside, the wind carried the faintest murmur of waves, but the usual cries of seabirds were absent. The silence was thick, a living entity pressing against their sanity. Marcus Lynn appeared suddenly at the entrance, his worn leather jacket damp with mist, eyes wide and wild. "You need to see this," he said, voice edged with both fear and fascination. The rock formations near the northern cliffs there shifting, not just eroding, but moving. It's as if the island itself is breathing, rearranging its bones. Evelyn rose unsteadily, heart pounding. They followed Marcus in somber procession through the fog, the ground beneath their feet morphing subtly, the familiar becoming alien. Patterns emerge, geological structures that defied logic, spiraling and fracturing in ways that mocked the laws of physics. "Look here," Marcus said, pointing to a jagged crevice that seemed to pulse faintly, a heartbeat beneath the stone. "It's alive, or something like it." The team stood in silence, the weight of revelation settling like a shroud. Dr. Samuel Ortiz, usually the skeptic, adjusted his glasses, voice low and uncertain. "If this is true, then everything we understand is flawed. Our science, our perceptions, they're inadequate for this place." Captain Jonas Reed joined them, his weather-beaten face drawn tight with worry as he gazed out toward the ocean. "The tide's washing away more than just footprints now," he said gravely. "It's erasing us. Our presence, our history soon. Nothing will remain." Evelyn swallowed hard. The island was more than a mystery. It was a force of oblivion, a manifestation of forgotten histories and erased identities. Their efforts to anchor themselves with names, memories, and scientific inquiry were fragile defenses against an overwhelming tide. Back at camp, the air hung heavy with unspoken fear. Evelyn's notes were a patchwork of half-remembered facts and fading impressions. She tried to piece together the island's story, a place born from centuries of lost peoples. A repository of silence that preserved by obliterating. Lena sat beside her, whispering the scattered words of the lost language, each syllable a thread holding the fraying fabric of their sanity. "We're chasing shadows," Lena murmured. "But maybe, in the shadows, there's a truth we can't yet grasp." Evelyn nodded, gaze distant. "Or a truth we're not meant to understand." As the night deepened, the island seemed to pulse with a quiet menace. The creeping silence was a promise and a threat and erasure, not just of the physical, but of identity and existence itself. The team was caught between the limits of human understanding and the vast unknowable. Their struggle an echo of forgotten histories, buried beneath waves and time. Somewhere in the shifting fog, the island waited, patient and eternal, as memories slipped away and the fragile threads of truth unraveled. And as dawn approached, Evelyn knew that whatever fragments of reality remained, they were slipping inexorably toward the edge of forgetting. The island's silence was no longer empty, it was a presence, a challenge, a final riddle that defied all their science and reason. The question lingered in the cold morning air. How do you fight an erasure that consumes not just your body, but your very essence? And in that question, the last flicker of hope battled the encroaching darkness, waiting for the moment when knowledge and oblivion would collide. The fragile balance held by naming rituals, scientific inquiry, and whispered languages was unraveling fast. Each moment on the island stretched the boundaries of their reality, pushing the team to confront the impossible. Evelyn's journal filled with fragmented thoughts and desperate hypotheses, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the shifting tides, the creeping silence, and the island's living terrain. The island was more than a place, it was a force, an entity born from forgotten histories, a manifestation of oblivion itself. Scientific understanding faltered in the face of its supernatural power, and the team's sanity frayed as memories slipped away like mist. They were running out of time and answers, yet in the fragments of truth they uncovered, there was a haunting beauty, a reminder that some mysteries exist beyond human comprehension, preserved only in silence and forgetting. As the island's fog thickened once more, Evelyn felt the weight of the unknown settle upon her shoulders. The final confrontation loomed, and with it, the ultimate reckoning between memory and oblivion. The island waited, patient and inexorable, ready to reclaim its silence. The island, a cruel phantom, shimmered with unnatural light, its edges wavering between substance and mist. Each breath they took was heavy with salt and silence alike, the oppressive stillness pressing inward, erasing the world with every passing moment. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she clutched a battered notebook, its pages filled with hurried observations, names, and desperate attempts to anchor reality. Lena sat beside her, pale and fragile, her voice barely more than a whisper as she repeated the lost words they had uncovered in the island's silent language. Together, they named the rocks, the trees, the distant silhouettes of forgotten lives. Each syllable a fragile tether against the erasure that sought to swallow them whole. "We have to hold on," Evelyn urged, her voice hoarse, eyes scanning the shifting terrain. "If we lose these names, if we forget who we are, what will become of us?" Lena nodded, her gaze fixed on a crumbling stone arch that had resisted the tide longer than any other landmark. "The silence wants us gone," she said softly, "but as long as we remember, it cannot claim us completely." Behind them, the island pulsed with a living breath, the tides rising unnaturally fast, licking over the edges of their fragile camp. The air was thick with a chilling quiet so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. Evelyn's heart pounded, each beat a defiant drum against the creeping void. Far off in the distance, the silhouette of Captain Jonas Reed's ship rocked gently on the restless sea. His rugged face was set in a mask of stoic sorrow, eyes never leaving the vanishing landmass that had consumed so many. He understood the gravity of their sacrifice. The island was not merely a place, but a force, a manifestation of forgetting itself. As darkness fell, the island's outline blurred and faded, a spectral mirage dissolving into the night. Evelyn's voice rose, trembling but resolute, as she called out the names of her team: Marcus, Mira, Eli, Nia, Samuel, voices from the past that threatened to vanish like mist. Lena joined her, their words weaving a fragile spell against oblivion. The wind carried their whispers across the empty shore, where spectral figures flickered briefly in the dim light before succumbing to silence. The island's tides surged one last time, washing away footprints, memories, and the very essence of existence. Evelyn felt the pull, the irresistible drag toward nothingness. But she fought with every ounce of will, her mind clinging to the last shards of identity. She knew the cost to remain was to vanish, but to leave was to condemn all to oblivion. Her sacrifice was the final anchor, a beacon of memory in a sea of silence. Lena, clutching the notebook, slipped away under the cover of darkness, carrying with her the fragile legacy of their journey. The island, now nothing more than a ghost on the horizon, disappeared from all maps, records, and minds. Captain Reed's ship sailed into the black waters, the silence left behind a haunting void where the island had been. The world would forget the expedition, the names, the faces, but somewhere beyond memory, in the restless tides and whispered winds, the salt and the silence endured. The story of the island would become myth, a whispered warning of the fragility of memory and the terror of being forgotten. And in that silent abyss between existence and erasure, the final truth remained. To be remembered was to resist the tide, but even memory was fragile, a fleeting flame in the vast, unyielding dark. Evelyn's last thoughts faded with the rising tide, a name whispered into the void: "Remember us." And then, silence.